To destroy a man's life, you don't need cannonballs, shrapnel, or enemy fire. Sometimes, all it takes is a trembling hand on the kitchen counter and a missed glance on a Tuesday morning to bring down the castle you've devoted your life to. I thought I was prepared for the worst. Gambling, secret debts, even a young and arrogant lover. But when I saw who my wife had sold her soul to on that gray street in that squalid neighborhood, I realized that what I thought was hell was just a childhood fear. The real apocalypse had come silently. Now, with my car parked at the corner of that street, let's go back to that moment just before I committed the most humiliating act of my life, that evening when I first caught the scent of betrayal. Welcome to my channel, my friends. I am Colonel Arthur Sterling. I am 66 years old. I'm one of those old-timers who divides life into us and them, right and wrong, order and chaos. If someone had told me that my 35 years of service and my rock-solid marriage would be reduced to dust because of a simple bank statement, I would have drawn my gun and accused them of lying right there and then. But I was wrong. It all began with the clatter of that damn porcelain cup. We were in the kitchen. The morning sun was hitting the granite countertop of our house, which I had spent the last 10 years of my retirement building with perfect symmetry. My wife, Eleanor. My elegant, fragile, and loyal Eleanor was looking out the window as if searching for a ghost among the neatly trimmed boxwoods in the garden. "Arthur," she said. Her voice was thin and ominous, like the cracking of a frozen lake in winter. "For Martha." I transferred a large sum for her treatment. You know how serious her condition is, the insurance costs. It wasn't enough. I slowly lowered the newspaper in my hand. This was the second lie I had heard about thousands of dollars evaporating from our joint account. The first, just a week ago, was a ridiculous investment story about a promising technology stock. Now the story had evolved into the tragedy of a sick friend. At that moment, for the first time in our 35-year marriage, I looked at Eleanor not as a husband, but as an interrogator. Her shoulders were slumped. Her neck, which always stood tall like a swan, seemed bent under an invisible weight. This was not the woman I knew, the reliable home front who had weathered the hardships of garrison life. I'll be honest with you, Couton. Because right now I have no one else to confide in but this camera lens. A soldier's life is a simple equation. Responsibility equals order. You are responsible not only for yourself, but also for the men under your command, the ammunition, and most importantly, your family. My home was my barracks. Eleanor was the most elegant commander of those barracks. When we married, she was just 25, a timid library clerk. I was a captain in my 30s, with a harsh temperament. Even within the damp walls of the barracks, she knew how to give me the comfort of a palace. When I returned home from duty reeking of gunpowder and stress, she knew when to be silent and when to offer me a glass of water. She was my shadow, my foundation. Over the years, we raised 2 children. Our son Richard takes after me. He is tough, devoid of emotion, reading the world through profit and loss statements. He is now a successful financier, and I am proud of him. Our daughter Clara is her mother's copy. Sensitive, artistic, like a colorful stain in my gray world. We watched them grow up and fly the nest. Then came retirement. Grandchildren arrived. I thought I could hang up my weapons and live peacefully in this indestructible fortress. But retirement gives a soldier its most insidious enemy: free time. Enough time to notice details I never had the strength to see before, to sense the stirrings in the shadows. It's an old habit. I check the accounts on the first Monday of every month. Discipline brooks no neglect. 3 months ago, I noticed a serious gap in the fund that came from our family inheritance and that we had designated as untouchable. It wasn't a small amount. It was painful. That evening at dinner, I asked Eleanor directly, "Eleanor, the shortfall in the fund. Do you have an explanation?" She slammed her fork down on the plate. I saw her flinch at that moment. "Oh yes, Art. Well, a friend recommended a very reliable fund. For the children, I thought it would be good for the grandchildren's education. I'm an old school guy. I don't understand the stock market or cryptocurrencies. For me, investment is land, it's bricks and mortar. But Eleanor had never been interested in money her whole life. I had complete control over the finances. Which friend? Which fund? How could you take such a risk without consulting me? I pressed her. She immediately cut me off, putting on that fake, anxious smile. "Don't worry, dear. Everything is under control. Would I ever harm our family?" I backed down. Maybe she was getting old, bored of sitting at home and looking for new thrills. But that little voice of suspicion inside me, once it wakes up, it never goes back to sleep. I kept quiet for a month. I watched. And when I saw the second big withdrawal, I called her into my office. I didn't yell. I just pointed to the numbers on the screen. And right then, the second version kicked in. "My friend Martha, she's in a terrible state, Art. Her husband left her, her insurance won't cover it. She could die." I knew Martha. She was an old friend from university. I immediately reached for the phone. "I'll call her husband. Maybe I can find some doctors I know from the army. Let's help her." Eleanor grabbed my wrist. Her fingers were ice cold as the touch of a corpse. "Don't call. I beg you, don't call, Arthur. She doesn't want anyone to know. She's a proud woman. I promised. I swore." At that moment, I collapsed into my chair. The woman who hadn't lied to me in 35 years, not even about missing items on the shopping list, was trembling as she looked into my eyes. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about Martha. It was the pure, primal fear I saw in her eyes, that look of horror, as if she'd rather die than have me learn the truth. That night I turned off the computer, but I couldn't stop the battle in my mind. Behind my front lines, in my safest zone, a tunnel had been dug, and the person holding the pickaxe was the woman I shared my bed with. Along with the lies, her behavior changed too. Eleanor, the woman who never liked leaving the house, was constantly out. "Charity meetings," she would say. "Library archive," she would say. She would put on her best clothes, spray on that heavy perfume I had brought her from Paris years ago, and leave. When she returned, she would be exhausted, her spirit drained, but with a strange, feverish gleam in her eyes. I, Colonel Sterling, whose life was built on intelligence and strategy, couldn't wander blindly in this fog within my own home. I had to break through the enemy line. I made my decision. The next time she walked out that door, I would follow her, not as a husband, but as a shadow. Waiting is a soldier's best-known torture. It's like waiting for the enemy in a trench. You don't know when they'll come, but you know blood will be spilled when they do. The 3 days after I made my decision passed in the suffocating fog of our home's sterile silence. Eleanor wandered around with exaggerated cheerfulness, humming meaningless melodies as she dusted the porcelain figurines. But her eyes, those eyes were filled with the unease of someone who knew the ground beneath her feet could collapse at any moment. With her frenzied activity, she seemed to be trying to drown out the sound of the approaching storm. I just watched, like a ghost, a spy, in my own home. It was Thursday afternoon on the fourth day, and the sky had turned a leaden gray. I was sitting in my leather armchair in the living room, flipping through the pages of a book I wasn't reading. Eleanor entered the room. She was wearing a beige cashmere coat and a silk scarf around her neck. That familiar, heavy perfume scent filled the room. "Arthur?" she said without looking at me, putting on her gloves. "I'm going to the clinic. I need to get Martha's test results. She's not doing very well." I slowly lowered the book onto my lap. "You sent her money for treatment. Isn't she in the hospital?" Eleanor froze for a moment as she reached for the door handle. I saw her face in the hallway mirror. Tense, a pale mask. "No, at home. She's receiving home care. I'm just going to pick up the paperwork. Don't wait for me for dinner, Arthur. I'll drop off some groceries and cheer him up." Another lie. Smooth, rehearsed, but to an old fox like me, it reeked of rotten meat. "All right," I said, keeping my voice as flat as possible. "Be careful." I gave her 15 minutes. When the door closed, I left the last remnants of what I felt as a husband in that room. I went down to the garage. I didn't start the sedan we used every day, but the old rusting Ford pickup I used to take fishing. This vehicle was my past, rough, noisy, and reliable. At the site exit, I caught up with her gray car. I started following her, keeping 2 cars back. Inside me there was still a foolish shred of hope that my mind had long since abandoned. Maybe she would turn back to the mall. Maybe she was really going to that woman's house, Martha. Maybe she had joined a cult. Maybe she was gambling. Believe me, my friends, at that moment I would have given my fortune to learn that my wife was a gambler, because the truth I was about to see was far more devastating than any of that. Eleanor turned off the city's glittering, elegant streets. She skirted the city center and turned the wheel toward that area I hadn't visited in years, the one that even faded on maps, the East Side. As the buildings changed, the knot in my stomach tightened. Well-kept gardens gave way to piles of trash, glass plazas replaced by crumbling apartment buildings. This was another world. A world without rules, order, or aesthetics. A world where my elegant, fragile Eleanor would never belong. His car stopped in front of a dilapidated apartment building, its walls defaced with graffiti and spray paint, its windows boarded up with cardboard. I parked a little further back, in the shade of a dried-up plane tree. Eleanor got out of the car. She looked around. Not like a lover waiting for someone, but like a fugitive checking to see if she was being followed. She squared her shoulders, looking as out of place as a lotus flower in the middle of that filth, and she disappeared into the dark building entrance. My knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. I looked at my watch. The minutes were passing as slowly as molten lead. Who was inside? Who was she feeding with my money? With the time she was stealing from my life? A young lover? A blackmailing criminal? I was creating scenarios in my head, killing her a little more in each one. Exactly 1 hour and 12 minutes. The apartment door creaked open heavily. Eleanor came out first. The woman I saw was not the elegant lady who had left the house an hour ago. Her shoulders were slumped. The officer's wife mask on her face had melted away. She was tired. She looked exhausted to the core. And then, he came out behind her. I narrowed my eyes. A man who looked to be in his mid-30s. But there was something strange about his gait. His body shook with uncontrollable spasms, and he dragged his right leg. He was wearing clean but mismatched clothes. He seemed to struggle to hold his head up. His face. Even from a distance, I could see the emptiness, the vulnerability in that face. He didn't look like a lover, nor did he look like a blackmailer. He looked more like someone the world had chewed up and spat out, someone incapable of standing on his own 2 feet. Eleanor turned to him. She straightened his collar. Then that man wrapped his arms around Eleanor in an uncontrolled movement. It wasn't a man embracing a woman. It was like a drowning man clinging to a lifebuoy. And Eleanor, my wife whom I couldn't bear to touch, who always kept her distance, stroked the man's thin, disheveled hair. On her face was a kind of primitive, devastating tenderness I had never seen before, never shown to me or our children. The way she looked then reminded me more of a mother comforting a wounded animal than a lover. I read goodbye on her lips. She hurried to her car, as if she couldn't leave if she looked back. The man stood in the doorway, swaying with his twisted body, watching the car drive away. I left him there, in the midst of that misery, and drove home. All the stones in my mind had shifted. Who was this disabled man? Why was my wife embracing him like that in this ruin? I arrived home before her. There was no anger left inside me. Anger is a warm emotion. What I felt was absolute zero. I went into my study. I turned on the computer. I printed out the bank statements for the last 3 months. Everything that proved those lies, those investments and treatments. I left the papers on the kitchen table, right in the middle of that flawless granite countertop. And in the dark, I sat down in my chair like a judge, waiting for the defendant to enter. The silence in the kitchen was like the silence before a battle, heavy, intense, and deafening. The bank statements lying on the table glowed like white death warrants. I sat in the chair opposite, my back straight, my hands clasped on the table. I was no longer a husband. I was a prosecutor, a judge, and my verdict was already clear. I heard the key turn in the front door lock. That metallic sound echoed in the silence of my home like the cocking of a gun. Eleanor entered the hall with grocery bags in her hands. Her footsteps were slow, the invisible weight on her shoulders pressing her down. "Arthur, are you home?" she called out. Her voice was trembling, but masked by that habitual fake cheerfulness. I didn't answer. I just kept staring at the kitchen door. Her steps approached the kitchen, and she appeared in the doorway. She paused when she saw me like that, standing stiffly at the head of the table in the dark. Then her gaze drifted to the papers on the table. I remember that moment like a slow-motion scene from a movie. The blood draining from his face, his lips turning chalk white, the bags in his hands slipping through his fingers and falling to the floor. The sound of the cans and jars inside clattering against each other broke the deadly silence. He understood everything. There was nowhere left to run, no lie left to hide behind. "Arthur," she whispered. Her voice was like a shard of glass stuck in her throat. I can explain. It's not what you think." "I'm not thinking anything, Eleanor," I said. My voice was so calm that even I was surprised by my own composure. While the volcano inside me erupted, on the outside I was a statue of ice. "I know. I was there. I saw you in that ruin, and I saw that man." That was the final blow. Her knees buckled. She tried to hold on to the edge of the counter but couldn't, slowly collapsing into the nearest chair. The Martha story, the investment lies, all vanished into thin air at that moment. "You followed me?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was an admission. "I was protecting my front," I corrected him. But apparently there was no front left to protect. "Explain." He buried his face in his hands. His shoulders began to shake. I expected hysterical crying, begging, but she just took deep, gut-wrenching breaths, as if she had been holding her breath underwater for years and was now surfacing for the first time. A minute passed, maybe a lifetime. I didn't rush her. I was ready to hear the truth, no matter how ugly it was. Finally, she lifted her head. She looked like she had aged 10 years in those 10 minutes. The makeup had run from her eyes, melting away that perfect Colonel's wife mask. "His name is Thomas," she said, her voice barely audible. I was silent. The name meant nothing to me. She swallowed, trying to loosen the knot in her throat. "Arthur, listen before you judge me. He's my son." The world stopped for a moment. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. A son? I knew about that short-lived marriage before me, the one she called a youthful mistake. She had told me she had run away from that man, that there was no child. "A son?" I repeated. The metallic tone in my voice cracked. "You have a son I didn't know about for 35 years, whose existence I was unaware of." "He's 38, she added, fixing her gaze on the floor. "He was born 3 years before I met you." That number was like a certificate of betrayal. 38. Before our perfect life, before Richard, before Clara, he was there. I was very young, Arthur. 19. His father, he was a drifter. He beat me, drank. When I got pregnant, I ran away. I took refuge with my aunt. The words spilled out faster as she spoke, as if stopping me would prevent her from continuing. When Thomas was born, we knew something was wrong. He was deprived of oxygen during birth, severe cerebral palsy, and mental retardation. He could never be a normal child. She looked at me. There was such helplessness in her eyes that my stomach churned. Then I met you. You were my savior, Arthur. With your uniform, your posture, your unshakable rules, you captivated me with your world where everything was black and white. But I was afraid. I was terrified that a perfectionist like you would never accept another man's child, especially a disabled one, that you would see me as flawed. "And you lied," I said in an icy voice. "You lied not to protect me, but to save yourself." "So I wouldn't lose you?" she shouted, her voice rising for the first time. "My aunt offered to look after him." "Build your life, girl," she said. "Don't let this child ruin your future." And I left Thomas with her. I thought it would be temporary. I thought I'd take him back once we'd settled down. But then Richard was born. Then Clara. Your appointments, your duties, your endless obsession with order. Thomas never fit into that equation. As I listened to her, I didn't recognize the woman sitting across from me. My Eleanor, the doting, compassionate mother, had left her own son behind in the past, like a suitcase. "My aunt died 5 years ago," she continued. Her voice dropped to a whisper again. "Thomas was left behind. He was going to be put into care. You know what state those state institutions are in, Arthur. I couldn't leave him there to die. I rented an apartment. I arranged for a caregiver. His medication, physical therapy, special food. The expenses were overwhelming. My savings weren't enough. Now the pieces were falling into place. That dilapidated house, Thomas's wretched state, Eleanor's embrace of motherly affection. Money, I said, chewing the word as if it had a disgusting taste in my mouth. My family's inheritance, our children's future. You took that money and, without my knowledge, poured it into that shadow life. He stood up, came over to me, and knelt down. He clung to the fabric of my pants. Arthur, I had no choice. He's my blood, my life. Yes, disabled. Yes, needy. But he's my son. I abandoned him once. I couldn't do it a second time. You wouldn't understand, Arthur. You hate weakness. You despise flaws. If I had told you, you would have said, take care of it, like solving a problem. But he's not a problem. He's a human being. Her words hit me like a slap in the face. Was she right? I don't know. But the only thing I felt at that moment was the sharp coldness of betrayal. I shook her hand off me, not with disgust, but as if touching a stranger. You're right, Eleanor, I said, standing up. I looked down at her pitiful state. I don't like flaws, but the flaw I hate isn't a physical disability. It's a disability of character. It's lying. It's betrayal. I walked toward the kitchen door. Arthur, what are you going to do? She called from behind me, still kneeling on the floor. I'm going to call the children, I said without looking back. Richard and Clara. They have a right to know they have an older brother, that their mother has been deceiving us all for 35 years with her smile. Let them decide who is family and who is a stranger. I went up to my study. As I climbed the stairs, I could hear Eleanor's sobs mingling with the silence below, but there was not a single flutter in my heart. The pen had fallen, the walls had crumbled, and the only thing I pulled out from under the rubble was 35 years of utter nothingness. In my study, I paced between the oak-paneled walls. The family photos lined up on the shelves stared back at me. Richard's graduation, Clara's first piano recital, our wedding anniversary with Eleanor. They all looked like nauseating theater props to me at that moment. The woman smiling in those pictures was actually mourning another child in her mind, a crippled and needy shadow. And I had taken my place on that stage like a foolish extra. I picked up the phone. My hands didn't shake. My decision was as certain as a bullet leaving the barrel. I called Richard. Dad? His voice came from the background of a noisy restaurant. He was probably at a business dinner. Come home immediately, I said. My tone carried that indisputable authority of the chain of command. Is there a problem, Mom? Mom is physically fine, but morally dead. Bring Clara too. This concerns both of you. We'll be there in 20 minutes. He didn't ask questions. Richard didn't ask questions. He solved operational problems. I hung up. I went downstairs. Eleanor was in the living room. She had stopped crying. She stood by the fireplace, staring at the cold ashes. She wasn't pacing like a caged animal. She had more of the eerie calm of a prisoner awaiting execution. I didn't feel anger toward her. A surgeon doesn't feel anger toward a gangrenous leg. He just knows it must be cut off. I heard an engine outside the door. Richard's black SUV pulled up, crunching gravel. The doors slammed shut. When they entered the living room, the stage was set. I sat in my armchair like a judge presiding over a table. Eleanor stood in the shadows. Richard entered, with his razor-sharp suit, piercing gaze, and unwavering confidence. He was a copy of my youth, even a more ruthless version of myself. Behind him was Clara, delicate, timid, her eyes immediately searching for her mother. Dad, what's going on? Clara's voice trembled. Seeing her mother in such a terrible state, she wanted to run and hug her. But Eleanor pulled away slightly, as if she had no right to touch her children. "Sit down," I said. Richard sat down right in the middle of the couch, legs crossed. Clara sat on the edge. "I called you here because the truth I learned today concerns not only my marriage, but the very foundation of this family, even their existence." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. The word existence meant sacred in his language. "Your mother," I said, choosing my words carefully, "has another son aged 38. The air in the room seemed to be sucked out. Clara covered her mouth with her hand. Richard looked at me with a blank expression, as if I had made a bad joke. "What?" Clara whispered. "Mom, is this true?" Eleanor bowed her head. "His name is Thomas," was all she could say. "But that's not the tragedy," I continued ruthlessly. "The tragedy is that for 35 years, your mother not only hid this truth from us, she also funneled our family's resources, my inheritance, your future, to that crippled, mentally disabled son of hers. She's been robbing us for years." And then, in that moment, the atmosphere in the room split in two. Clara moaned, "Mom!" and ran to Eleanor, throwing her arms around her. "Do you have a son, and is he sick? My God, how alone you must have felt." But Richard, my pragmatic son, his father's son, Richard, looked not at his mother, but at me. There was no shock or sadness in his eyes. Only a cold calculator was working. "How much?" he asked. His voice was so emotionless that even I flinched. "Richard?" Clara turned to her brother in horror. "What are you talking about? He says we have a brother, and you're talking about money?" "I'm talking about facts, Clara," Richard said, without raising his voice. He fixed his gaze on his mother. There was no love of a son in that gaze. There was the accusatory attitude of an auditor. "I now understand why there have been unexplained withdrawals from that account for years. Father is right. This isn't a family matter. It's corporate fraud." Eleanor shrank at her son's words. "Richard, he's your brother. He's helpless. He can't walk, he can't talk. Should I have left him to die?" "You should have told us, Mom," Richard said, standing up. "If you had come to us, we would have found a solution. A cheap state institution, a nursing home. But you chose to throw this family's capital into that black hole. That's theft." I was watching the scene. On one side, emotional Clara, who saw her mother's pain as sacrifice and was crying. On the other side, Richard, who saw the whole thing as financial loss and judged his mother like a criminal. What had I created? I heard the echo of my own logic in Richard's words, but that echo sounded so terrible coming from someone else's mouth. Still, I couldn't back down. The order had been disrupted and needed to be restored. "Enough," I said. My voice cracked like a whip. "The discussion is over. Eleanor, you made your choice 35 years ago. You chose that other family, that lie." I stood up and looked into my wife's eyes, those of a stranger. "There is no place for lies in this house. Tomorrow morning you will meet with my lawyer. I'm not asking for anything from you. I don't want back the money you spent on Thomas, the money you loved so much. Just go. Right now." "Dad!" Clara screamed. "You can't do this! She's a sick old woman. Where will she go? After 35 years, you're throwing her out onto the street?" "She's not going to the street, Clara," I said calmly. "She's going home, to where she belongs, to Thomas. I'm setting her free." Clara looked at me with hatred. For the first time, I saw pure disgust in the eyes of my daughter, who had always looked at me with admiration until that day. "You're a monster," she said. "You have no heart, only rules." She grabbed her mother's arm and pulled her. "Come on, Mom. We're coming to my house. You can't stay in this icebox another minute." Eleanor looked at me one last time. There was no apology in her eyes, only deep sorrow and perhaps a sense of relief. The heavy burden she had carried for years had finally been lifted from her shoulders. She said nothing. With Clara's support, she staggered toward the door. Richard didn't even move as they left. He just shook his head and said, "Legally, we can get the money back, Dad. Inheritance law is on our side. Expenses incurred for a mentally disabled person, guardianship, will win the case." I looked at him, at my own son, and shuddered. His mother had just been crushed under the wreckage of her life, walked out the door, and he was still talking about the case. "No, Richard," I said wearily. "I don't care about the money. It's just over." The front door closed. The sound of the engine faded away. Left behind were me, Richard, and that huge, perfect, silent house. That night, after Eleanor and Clara left, I locked the door. I slid the bolt. I set the alarm. The pen was mine again. It was safe. But inside it was as cold and echoing as an abandoned cathedral. For the first time in 35 years, I was alone in that house. I didn't go into our bedroom. That bed, those sheets, that room, they were all tainted with lies. I couldn't bear anything that had Eleanor's scent on it. I went to the guest room. I tried to sleep on that narrow, single bed with its starched, unused sheets, as if I were in a soldier's barracks. Or rather, I stared at the ceiling, waiting for dawn. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock a.m. Richard was punctual. He was never late. Together we went to his glass and steel tower in the city center, to his lawyer's office. The lawyer was a man about Richard's age, with a shark-like smile. He spread the files on the table. "Mr. Sterling," he said confidently, "your son has summarized the situation. We have a very strong case. Your wife's expenditures from the joint account, funds transferred to a disabled person who is not your legal responsibility. This is clearly marital infidelity and aggravated fraud. Not only will we get a divorce, but we will recover every penny she spent, with interest. We can even investigate the state benefits that other man, that Thomas, received." Richard nodded in agreement. "We'll destroy him, Dad. He has to pay for what he did. Think of it like a hole in the company accounts. It needs to be plugged." I looked at my son. There wasn't a shred of mercy for his mother in his eyes. He saw only a case to be won, a debt to be collected. Why did this strong man, whom I had raised and was proud of, now seem so frightening to me? I slammed my palm on the table. Not hard, but loud enough to silence the room. "No!" The lawyer paused. "Sir, no lawsuit, no dragging it out, no dirty laundry being aired in courtrooms." "But Dad," Richard interjected, "he robbed you." "I don't care, Richard." My voice rose. "I don't want the money. I don't want revenge. I just want her erased. I want that woman erased from my surname, from my life, from my deed. I'll take the house, pay her share, give her more if you have to. Just get her to sign and make her disappear." Richard looked at me as if I were an emotional old fool. "That's a strategic mistake," he said coldly. "It's an order," I said. He fell silent. He was programmed not to question his father's orders. The divorce was as quick and bloodless as a surgical operation. Eleanor didn't come to court. I didn't see her face. Her lawyer and Clara were there as her representatives. Clara sat on the other side, behind the witness stand. She didn't look at me once. Her eyes were swollen, her shoulders slumped. She just looked at the judge and accepted everything on her mother's behalf. Compensation, alimony, rights to the house. Eleanor didn't ask for anything. She just wanted to go to Thomas, to that small, shabby apartment, to carry the burden alone. Clara didn't come to me at the exit. Richard was by my side, walking like a victorious commander. Clara, however, quickly walked away, as if she might catch a disease from us, and it was over. In one day, a 35-year-old book closed. I returned home. It was now only my home. The following months passed in a gray haze. I had finally established the order I wanted. There was no longer an extra towel in the bathroom, forgotten cream on the counter, or a pair of shoes scattered at the entrance. Everything was in its place, as if drawn with a ruler. I arranged my books in order of height. I weeded every single weed in the garden. Even though no one used the pool, I cleaned it every day and measured the pH level. My home resembled a sterilized operating room or a museum with no visitors more than a living space. Richard called every evening. It was a ritual. But these weren't father-son conversations. They were status reports. "Good evening, Dad. How's your blood pressure?" "Stable, Richard." "Yours?" "Everything's fine. We weathered the storm in the Asian markets. We're on track for our quarter-end targets." "Good. Do you need anything?" "No, thanks." "Okay. Good night." He never mentioned his mother. He never asked about Clara. For him, that file was closed. Those toxic assets had been wiped from the balance sheet. He carried on with his life as if he had never had a mother. And I, on the other end of the line, hung up the phone, weighed down by the knowledge that I had created this emotionless machine with my own hands. At night, in that vast silence, I caught myself listening to the echo of my footsteps on the polished parquet. I had won, hadn't I? I had banished the lie. I had restored order. So why was that dark, bottomless void in the center of my chest, right where my heart was, growing a little bigger every day? Why did I sometimes feel like I would give my fortune just to hear the smell of coffee coming from the kitchen, or Eleanor's nonsensical mumbling for just a moment? No, that was weakness. I wasn't weak. I was Colonel Sterling, and my front was flawless. It was just very quiet. Time is a soldier's most unreliable ally. Sometimes it passes as quickly as a bullet reaching its target. Sometimes as slowly as the final hour of a watch. For me, that year that passed was an endless gray day measured not by calendar pages, but by the lengthening and shortening of shadows. I continued to live my life according to code. 0600, wake up. Bed making, the sheets so perfectly taut that if you tossed a coin on them, it would bounce. 0630, breakfast. 1 boiled egg, 1 slice of toast, black coffee. 0800, perimeter check. I checked the garden walls, the alarm sensors, the door locks. The pen was secure. No enemy could infiltrate. But a castle's greatest enemy isn't the army outside. It's the silence within. In the evenings, sitting alone in that huge living room, I realized the silence had a physical weight. The armchair where Eleanor used to sit was now empty. Sometimes I would glance over there, imagining I could see her silhouette. How she would let her glasses slip down to the tip of her nose while reading a book. How she would sniffle while watching those ridiculous pink soap operas. To fight these ghosts, I immersed myself in books of military memoirs. World War II, Vietnam, Korea. Stories where the enemy was recognizable by their uniform, the ally by their trench, where the rules were clear. But even between the lines, I couldn't silence that question. What if I was wrong? Our phone conversations with Richard had become completely mechanical. He was no longer my son, but a biological extension of myself. Successful, wealthy, powerful, and utterly soulless. In that cold, metallic tone of his voice, I heard the echo of my own mistakes. I had made him this way. This man, who saw emotions as weakness and compassion as a strategic mistake, was my creation. Clara, on the other hand, Clara was my personal nightmare. She came once a month, on duty. She brought my grandchildren, but those lively children no longer ran into their grandfather's arms. They had drawn an invisible line between themselves and Misa. I don't know what Clara had told them, but they looked at me with fear, as if I were a ticking time bomb. Clara moved around the house like a shadow. As she arranged the food containers she had prepared for me in the refrigerator, her silence felt like a reproach, an accusation. And one day, the dam burst. It was November. Outside, a bone-chilling rain was falling. Clara paused as she placed my blood pressure medication on the kitchen table. She was clutching the cashmere scarf in her hand so tightly, her knuckles had turned white. "I saw him," she said. Her voice was quieter than the patter of rain on the window. "My mother." I didn't put down my newspaper. "I'm glad for you, Clara." "Dad!" she suddenly burst out. Her voice echoed in the kitchen. "Stop ignoring me. It's bad, really bad. That apartment is damp. It doesn't heat up. Thomas's condition has worsened. His seizures are more frequent. My mother's back can't take it anymore. While trying to lift him," her voice trembled, turning into a sob. "His hands, those elegant hands, covered in bruises from bleach and heavy lifting." I folded the newspaper slowly and placed it on the table. "It was her choice, Clara," I said, trying to keep the armor in my voice intact. "She was given options. She could have stayed. We could have gotten professional help for Thomas. That's what government agencies are for. But she chose to sacrifice herself. He's an adult." "He's a mother!" Clara shouted. Tears streamed from her eyes. "This is something you'll never understand. She couldn't abandon her child to an institution, to those cold walls. Dad wants money, not for himself, for Thomas's new medication. Social Security doesn't cover it." I took a deep breath. Even the air filling my lungs was cold. "No." "What?" "No, Clara. Not a single penny from my account, from my house, will go into that bottomless pit. We discussed this in court. Your mother agreed. She paid the price, and that's the end of it." Clara looked at me. What I saw in her eyes at that moment wasn't hatred. It was worse than hatred. Pity. She looked at me as if I were a terminally ill patient with no cure. "I understand," she whispered. "Richard was right. You're not a living man, Dad. You're a walking regulation. There isn't even a stone where your heart should be. Only rules." She picked up her bag. "Kids," she called into the living room. "We're leaving. Now." When the door slammed shut, The house was once again plunged into that dreadful silence. But that night, sleep wouldn't come. I got up. I wandered around the house. Clara's words kept running through my mind. Her hands are covered in wounds. I thought of Eleanor's hands, those soft hands that played the piano, ironed my shirts, rubbed my temples when my head ached. Now those hands were caring for a stranger I had never seen, never wanted to see, that crippled man. I went into my study. I opened the safe. Inside were cash, deeds, and my gun. I looked at the money, those pieces of paper I guarded so closely that Richard considered sacred, that I had torn my family apart for. For a moment, just a moment, my hand went to that stack. Maybe secretly, I thought. Then I quickly pulled my hand back. No. This was weakness. This was breaking discipline. If I gave in once, my entire defense would collapse. I slammed the safe shut. But that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the sound of the rain outside sounded to me like Eleanor's crying. And for the first time, I felt a tiny crack in that perfect, unshakable Colonel Sterling armor. I was rusting, and rust silently eats away at iron. As the rust of time slowly gnawed away at my armor, the phone rang again. It was November again. The sky was the color of dirty dishwater. It was Clara calling. I answered the phone, expecting another request for money, another wave of complaints. I was on guard, my words loaded like bullets in the chamber. But Clara's voice was different. There was none of that familiar anger or that weary, tearful tone. Her voice was flat, dry and empty like a desert wind. "Dad," she said, "I'm listening, Clara." "It's over," she said, "just that." I paused for a moment. "What's over? Did your mom do something?" "No," Clara said, taking a deep breath. "The war is over, Dad. Mom gave up. Thomas is leaving." An involuntary wave of relief rose within me. "Is he dead?" I asked. Perhaps I couldn't hide the glimmer of hope in my voice. "No," Clara said sharply. "He's not dead. But for my mother, it's as good as death. She's worn out, Dad. Last week, her herniated disc ruptured. She can't get him out of bed anymore. She can't cope with Thomas's increasingly aggressive episodes. The doctors warned her. Either her own health would suffer or," she swallowed, "or she'd have to leave him. And she gave in. We've arranged for Thomas to go to a state care home. A place has been found. He'll be admitted on Sunday." I remained silent. So logic had prevailed in the end. So Eleanor had given up her emotional obsession, her senseless sacrifice. I had been right, as always. "That's the sensible thing to do, Clara," I said, a note of triumph in my voice. "It should have been done from the start." "Don't you dare," Clara said, her voice hissing. "Don't you dare say that to my mother's face. She's like a living dead person right now. She feels like a mother who abandoned her child. She hates herself." "So what do you want from me?" "A farewell," said Clara. "Before Thomas enters the institution, my mother wants to see us all together one last time. You, me, Richard, and Thomas." My breath caught in my throat. "With him?" I said. You want me to sit at the same table with that cripple in my house?" "He's not a cripple, Dad. His name is Thomas." Clara raised her voice for the first time. "And yes, with him, because he's the reason this family is falling apart, isn't he? In your eyes, He's a monster, a thief, a parasite. Mom. Mom wants you to see him just once. She wants you to see what you're rejecting, what you're afraid of. Never, I said firmly. I won't let that stranger in. Then forget about your grandchildren, said Clara. It wasn't a threat, just a cold observation. If you don't open that door for us this Sunday at 3:00 p.m., I swear, Dad, you'll never see my face or my children's faces again. Even Richard agreed. He's coming too. Richard? That surprised me. Why is he coming? Because he wants closure too. He wants to close the book completely. Please, Dad. You don't have to make peace. You don't have to forgive. Just open the door. Thomas will leave anyway. You won't see him again. Just, let's end this story on a proper note. I wanted to hang up the phone, cut off all lines, but I couldn't. Maybe I was afraid of being alone in that silent house inside my rusting armor. Or maybe deep down I wanted to rub my righteousness in their faces one last time. I wanted to see Eleanor's miserable state, her defeat. All right, I said in a cold voice. Sunday, 3:00 p.m., but don't be a minute late. And that child mustn't touch anything. Thank you, Dad, Clara said, and hung up. I didn't wait for that Sunday. I prepared for it as if preparing for a military inspection. On Saturday, I cleaned the house from top to bottom. It was already clean, but I wanted it to be sterile. I removed anything that looked warm, left over from Eleanor's time. I threw the cushions into storage. I removed the vase from the table. I turned the living room into a briefing room. I arranged the chairs not facing each other, but in an interrogation room layout. Tea, coffee, refreshments. I didn't prepare anything. This wasn't a family visit. This was the signing of a surrender agreement. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my study, listening to the ticking of the clock. Thomas, that shadow that had been gnawing away at my life for years, consuming my fortune. I was finally going to see him. In my mind, I had imagined him to be a monster, a sneaky, greedy parasite who exploited his mother. I was sure that when I saw him, my stomach would churn and I would be disgusted. And Sunday arrived. At exactly 3:00 p.m., the doorbell rang right on the dot. I looked at myself in the mirror. My shirt was sharp as a razor. My hair was combed. My face bore that unshakable expression forged by years. I went downstairs. I opened the door. They were standing on the porch. Strange, mismatched, like a melancholy manga. Richard was in front. In his gray suit, with a leather briefcase in his hand, he looked like he was coming to another job interview. He gave me a brief nod. Dad. Behind him was Clara. She looked pale, her eyes swollen from crying. And behind them, a figure in a wheelchair and Eleanor pushing it. Eleanor. Oh my God. It had been over a year since I'd seen her. She had shrunk. Her shoulders were slumped, and there was more gray in her hair. Her face bore the deep, dignified but broken sadness of a general who had lost a war. She wasn't looking at me. She was just clutching the armrests of the chair tightly. And the chair. I slowly lowered my gaze to look at that monster, that thief. And for the first time in my life, I saw how misleading my strategy, my intelligence, my prejudices were. Because the thing sitting in the chair was not a monster. It resembled a wrinkled child more than a 38-year-old man. His body was contorted with spasms. His hands were clasped over his chest like bird claws. He couldn't hold his head up straight. It was tilted slightly to one side. But his eyes, those eyes he turned toward me from the chair Clara had pushed him into, they were clear, water blue, and frighteningly innocent. There was no cunning in them. There was no calculation, no hatred, only pure, unfiltered curiosity. A thin trickle was running from the corners of his lips, and Eleanor, completely forgetting my presence at that moment, wiped her son's mouth with a handkerchief she took from her pocket. The tenderness in that gesture was so natural, so reflexive. It was a closeness I had never seen in our 35 years of marriage. "Can we go in, Arthur?" Eleanor asked. Her voice was fragile but steady. I stepped back from the doorway. "Go in," I said. My voice sounded foreign even to me. The wheelchair's tires squeaked across my polished parquet floor as it rolled inside. The monster had entered the castle, but it wouldn't take me long to realize that it wasn't the most terrifying thing in the castle. The wheelchair's wheels struggled across the Persian rug and came to a halt in the middle of the living room. I remembered how much Eleanor and I had argued when choosing that rug. I had loved the geometric patterns, that perfect symmetry. Now, on top of those symmetrical patterns, sat a man whose body was completely asymmetrical, contorted with spasms. "Sit down," I said, trying to keep the commanding tone in my voice. Richard sat at the far end of the couch, as far away from Thomas as possible. He crossed his legs and smoothed the creases in his pants. Clara sat down next to her mother, right at the edge of Thomas's chair. Eleanor was standing. She didn't let go of the chair's arms, as if she were on guard, as if letting go would make her son fall or make me attack. Silence. That heavy, dusty silence that had settled on the walls of my room had descended once more. Only Thomas's wheezing breaths and the occasional involuntary moans he let out could be heard. These sounds were like parasites in my sterile world. Richard glanced at his watch. I could almost hear the ticking of that expensive Swiss-made watch. "Yes," said Richard, tearing through the silence like paper. "We're all here. The purpose of this meeting, as I understand it, is to close the books on past accounting errors and wipe the slate clean." "Accounting errors," Clara hissed through her teeth. "Richard, there's a human being standing in front of you." Richard shot Thomas a brief, dismissive glance. "Let's put sentimentality aside, Clara. Let's be realistic. My mother made a choice. She paid a price. Now this situation," he gestured toward Thomas, "is being transferred to state care. That's the logical thing to do. The reason I came here is to ensure that there will be no future claims on my father or our inheritance." I fixed my eyes on Thomas. Did the man Richard was speaking so cruelly to understand these words? His head tilted slightly to the side, staring into space. He didn't even notice the drool running from the corner of his mouth. In that moment, I felt a sickening chasm between Richard's cold logic and Thomas's vulnerability. And I realized with horror that Richard was on the side of that chasm where I belonged. "There's no demand, Richard," said Eleanor. Her voice was tired, but there was a steel-like hardness in it. She took a handkerchief from her pocket and wiped Thomas's mouth. "Thomas doesn't need money. He doesn't have the mind to understand either money or inheritance. He just lives." "Lives," Richard repeated with a mocking smile, "if you can call it that. Years of my father's resources were spent to sustain this barren existence, for nothing." "Richard!" I shouted. My voice boomed through the room. Richard turned to me in surprise. "What, Dad?" I'm saying what you taught me, to cut out the unproductive investment. I fell silent. My own words, my own philosophy, had hit me in the face. Yes, I had taught him, but I never imagined it would sound so raw, so savage. Thomas suddenly became agitated. He threw his head back and made a guttural sound. Ah! His hands clenched, and he began hitting the edges of the chair. Eleanor immediately knelt in front of him. Shh, it's okay, Tommy. It's okay. Mommy's here. She stroked his hair, resting her cheek against those twisted hands. Don't be afraid. We're just talking. In that scene, in that contact, there was such power that all the expensive furniture in the room, my order, Richard's logic, became meaningless. In front of me there was only a mother trying to calm her child. Why did you bring him? I asked, my voice hoarse. Why did you bring him here, Eleanor? Eleanor straightened up. She turned to me. So you can see him, Arthur, she said. So you can see what you're fighting. You created a monster in your head, an enemy that robbed you, that deceived you. But look, she pointed at Thomas. This is your enemy, a child who can't walk, can't feed himself, needs diapers. I didn't betray you for 35 years, Arthur. I just tried to protect this truth that you would never accept. Because I knew I would see the disgust I see in Richard's eyes right now in yours, too. I wanted to say something, but the words caught in my throat. I'm not disgusted. You're not disgusted, Eleanor said with a bitter smile. But you don't accept it either. There's no room for flaws in your world. Thomas is a flaw. And because I love that flaw, I became a traitor in your world. Richard stood up. I think this dramatic scene is enough. Dad, I had the legal waiver prepared. If Mom signs it. Get out, Richard, I said. Richard froze. What? I said, get out. My voice boomed. Take your papers, your damn bag, and get out of my house. But Dad, I'm here for you. You're not here for me. You're here for your own pride. Don't you see? Your mother is suffering. Your brother, that child is suffering, and you're still talking about pieces of paper. Go! Richard staggered under the shock of being rejected for the first time in his life. He grabbed his bag and headed for the door, shooting Clara and her mother a hateful look. The sound of the front door closing echoed like the lid of a coffin. The room fell silent again. But this silence was different. With Richard's poisonous presence gone, only pure sadness remained. Thomas had calmed down. He was looking at me. Those watery blue eyes were fixed directly on mine. There was no judgment in them. He was just looking. Involuntarily, as if pulled by an invisible string, I took a step toward him. Eleanor tensed, but Clara stopped her by placing her hand on her mother's shoulder. I stood in front of Thomas. I looked at those wrinkled hands, those stiff legs, that innocent face. Was this child the thief of my fortune? Was this child the murderer of my marriage? No. I was the murderer. The murderer was my pride, my fear, my obsession with perfection. Eleanor was right. If I had known from the beginning, would I have accepted him? Would that young, ambitious Captain Arthur Sterling have taken this disabled child into his arms? Knowing the answer was no was the sharpest knife to my heart. So, slowly, I reached out my trembling hand. I touched Thomas's clenched fist. His skin was thin, warm. Thomas didn't flinch. Instead, he loosened his fingers slightly and touched my finger. That touch, that tiny, weak touch was enough to shatter my 66-year-old steel armor. My eyes filled with tears. I didn't cry. Colonels don't cry. But the enormous dam inside me had broken. "I'm sorry," I whispered. I didn't know who I was saying it to. Thomas? Eleanor? Or the old man I saw in the mirror? "Arthur?" Eleanor's voice was shocked. "Take him away, Eleanor," I said, pulling my hand away. I took a step back. I didn't have the strength for more. "Take him. Don't put him in that institution. Don't." "What?" Eleanor and Clara held their breath at the same time. "The money." I swallowed. "The inheritance. I'll give it all. The best nursing home, private nurses, whatever it takes. But don't put him in that state dump." Eleanor looked at me. There was no gratitude in her eyes, only deep sorrow. "It's too late, Arthur," she said. "Why? I have money. I have power." "It's not about the money," said Eleanor, turning Thomas's chair back. "The thing is, we can't trust you anymore. Today you show mercy. Tomorrow the order breaks down and you give up. Thomas isn't a piece of furniture, Arthur. You can't take him one day and throw him away the next. We've made our decision." "But goodbye, Arthur," she said. She pushed the wheelchair toward the door. Clara followed them. Clara stopped at the door and looked at me one last time. There was no hatred in her eyes anymore, only pity. "You tried, Dad," she said quietly. "At least in the end, you tried to be human for a moment." And they left. The door closed. I was left alone in that enormous, flawless, sterile house, staring at the muddy tracks Thomas's wheelchair had left on the floor. Those tracks were the most beautiful and the most painful things I had ever seen in my life. After the door closed, I don't know how long I stood there, on those polished parquet floors. Minutes. Hours. My eyes were on the floor. On the Iranian rug, two brown, muddy lines mixed in with the ocean blue patterns, the tracks of Thomas's wheelchair. Normally, if it were old Colonel Sterling, he would have rushed to the cleaning cupboard, grabbed stain remover sprays and brushes, and erased that flaw. He wouldn't have stopped until the rug was back to its original symmetry. But I didn't. I looked at those marks and realized that erasing them would be erasing the last human thing left in my life. That mud was the only real thing in my sterile world. The house began to close in on me. The walls seemed to narrow, the ceiling to lower. The silence I had once boasted about had now turned into a deafening scream. I grabbed the keys. I went down to the garage. I got into my old Ford truck. I started the engine. The engine roared with a loud, rough sound. That sound brought me back to myself a little. I didn't know where I was going. I just wanted to get away from this castle, this monument. I drove aimlessly under the city lights. I passed through the financial district with Richard's glass towers, cold, soulless, and bright, just like my son. Then I passed through the orderly streets of the suburbs. And I found myself driving, as if the steering wheel had a will of its own, into that other neighborhood, the East Side, Eleanor's new world. I pulled the car into the shade beneath that same plane tree where I had parked it months ago. I turned off the engine and waited. The street lamp at the building's entrance flickered on and off. There were cracks in the sidewalk, puddles on the road. This place was the complete opposite of my world. Chaotic, dirty, and unsafe. But a warm, yellow light was shining from the third-floor window. The curtains were open. I could see inside. Clara was there. She was rushing around with a towel in her hand. Then Eleanor passed in front of the window. She had a pile of pillows in her arms. And Thomas, I couldn't see him, but I knew he was there. In that small, cramped room, perhaps struggling to breathe. I watched them. I watched Eleanor approach the window and gaze out into the darkness. She was tired, her back bent, her hair disheveled. But on her face was an expression I had never seen when she was with Mimung. Presence. She was there. She was in that moment. She had a purpose, a battle, someone worth exhausting herself for. What did I have? My priceless paintings? My stain-resistant couches? My interest-bearing accounts? I put my hand on the doorknob. I wanted to go down, run up those stairs, pound on that door. I wanted to shout, "Take me too!" Forget the money, forget the pride. Just squeeze me into a corner of that room. Just save me from this emptiness. But my hand froze on the doorknob. I couldn't do it. Eleanor was right. I was unreliable. Today I would show mercy. Tomorrow I would be disgusted by that dirty street, that damp smell, and I would long for my order. I was a cowardly commander, unable to step outside my comfort zone. I couldn't change Thomas's diaper. I couldn't stay awake during night shifts. My love only existed when conditions were perfect. Theirs, however, bloomed in the mud. I leaned back. I rested my head on the steering wheel, and in that moment, I understood what victory tasted like. Victory was the taste of rusty metal in your mouth. Victory was returning to a home where no one was waiting for you. Victory was the icy loneliness that comes with being right. I had won. I had banished the lie. I had protected my money. But I had left my humanity under that oak tree, in front of that ruined building. I started the engine again. I looked at the light in Eleanor's window one last time. That light had long since gone out for me. It was midnight when I got home. I went inside. The muddy footprints on the carpet had dried. I stepped over them. I felt like I didn't even have the right to step on those marks. I went up to my study. I didn't turn on the light. I sat in the dark. Richard was right. We had cut out the unproductive investments. Clara was right. I had no heart. I had a rule book. Eleanor was right. It was too late. I picked up the family photo on my desk. I wanted to throw it on the floor and break it, but I couldn't. Instead, I placed it back exactly where it had been. Because that's who I am. I am Arthur Sterling. In my world, glasses don't break, voices don't rise, and no one cries. They just die slowly, silently. Here it is, my friends. This is my story. The anatomy of a betrayal, a discovery, and a victory won. I told you I would be honest. I'm here not to justify myself, but simply to tell the story. Because in this house, within these walls with their perfect acoustics, my voice doesn't echo. Only this camera, this lens, and you, watching me from the other side of the world, can hear my voice. Maybe you're judging me. You're saying, he's a heartless man, just like my daughter Clara. Or you're saying, he's a man who stands up for himself. just like my son Richard. Believe me, I don't care about either of them. Because at night, when I lie down in that sterile bed, it's not Richard's achievements or Clara's hatred that keep me awake. What keeps me awake are Thomas's blue eyes and the warm yellow light in Eleanor's window. I wonder, what are they doing right now? Maybe Eleanor is feeding him soup. Maybe Thomas is trying to hum a song in that hoarse voice of his. And maybe, just maybe, in that small, damp room, there is a peace I could never find in my palace of a home. I am Colonel Arthur Sterling. I have dedicated my life to rules, discipline, and purity. And I have succeeded. My house is clean. My account is full. My surname is spotless. But shall I tell you a military secret? If there is no one beside you in the trenches, winning the war means nothing. If you listened to this old man's confessions and thought about the cracks you hide in your own lives, in your own perfect worlds, like the video, I want to know, how many of us are there? How many of us are trapped inside our castles? Write in the comments, my friends. Which city are you watching from? What time is it? And most importantly, are there muddy marks on your carpet that you can't bring yourself to wipe away? I'll read them. I'll read every single one, because I have nothing else to do, no guests to wait for. Subscribe to my channel. Here every week I'll continue to tell the stories of those who lose while winning. Just like life. I'm Arthur, and this is my pen. Farewell to all of you. But most importantly, don't be alone.